This is Emily Blackshear with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the Oklahoma State University Library. Today is Wednesday, October 6, 2021, and we're recording this interview remotely. This morning, I'm interviewing Jenny Yang Cropp for the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Oral History Project. Jenny, you're a professor of creative writing and publishing at Southeast Missouri State University. You're also a poet and author of the chapbooks Hanging the Moon, Not a Bird or a Flower. And your full-length collection of poetry, String Theory, was a finalist for the Oklahoma Book Awards in 2016. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So let's start by getting to know a little bit about you. Could you tell me where you were born and where you grew up?
Yeah, it sounds like an easy question, but
yeah.
I was born in El Paso, Texas. My dad was military, and so I consider Lawton, Oklahoma, my hometown, but we actually moved around a lot, especially through elementary school. So I think it was Oklahoma, Kansas, New Jersey, Germany.
Oh wow.
And then in sixth grade, I came back to Lawton. And so from sixth grade through college, through undergrad, then Oklahoma was my home.
Yeah, so living in all of these different places, what do you think it was about Oklahoma that really made you feel like it was home? So I've talked to other people with military backgrounds who didn't necessarily identify with one particular place as their home. So I'm wondering, what is it about Oklahoma that did that for you?
So my grandparents are from Fort Worth, and in the 60s, my grandfather's sister moved to Lawton. Her husband was a pastor at a small church there, and so my grandfather followed her. And so in the 60s, he moved to Lawton and started a church and built a house. And so it was my father's hometown. Like, he grew up there, went to elementary school, junior high, and high school in Lawton. And then he joined the military to get out. So he jokes about how he tried to get out and was just stationed back there. And so for me, it was his home, and then it became my home.
Yeah. How would you describe Lawton to people who have never been there? Because it's got some interesting, I think when we were talking about this before the interview, just some interesting geographic features too, kind of nearby the Wichita Mountains. Or it surprised me when I saw it for the first time.
It's sort of a weird shaped town too. It's like really narrow and long, right?
Yeah.
And that's because of that border with Fort Sill and the mountains. And so it can't spread any other way. It can only go that east-west direction.
Yeah.
And so I always think it's interesting that everything's so flat, and everything's sort of bleached out. And can seem really dull, but you hit a certain point on your way into Lawton and you see those mountains in the background. Yes. Although we joke that like they're so old, that mountain range is so old that they're really hills. Like people who have seen like mountains laugh when I say mountains, and then they see it. But for us, that those mountains rising in the background, it's beautiful, and it was always a place to go to kind of escape, to go out to the refuge and go up to the top of the mountain and look out.
Yeah. And and Lawton's it's a small town, so what sorts of things did you like to do for fun there growing up, or did you find going out into nature to be more of a thing you enjoyed doing?
I was definitely, I don't go out into nature a lot. I did like to go up to the top of the mountain. Something about, I like the shift in perspective more than I like being out in nature. I would say growing up there, my hobbies were classic nerd hobbies. I spent a lot of time writing, reading. School was, my major preoccupation. I'd say. Yeah, there wasn't a lot to do in Lawton.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of laughing because I have talked to other people from there. And when I tell them, oh, wow, this place, they're like, what are you talking about? There's nothing to do here. I grew up
Yeah,
in a place that's kind of similar. So, it's just funny how other people might perceive things. But let's talk about what you like to read and what you like doing, and maybe your early experiences with reading, and maybe those first memories you have of writing something that was creative. What do you remember about that?
yeah. So I think it's funny now. I didn't really have much exposure to poetry at all growing up.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I read a lot of fiction. Um, Anything I could get my hands on and anything that teachers gave me, I would read. I didn't have preferences. I just was a voracious, like, give it all, give me
Yeah.
everything.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I wrote short stories in high school.
Mhm.
And my favorite novel at that time was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I think
Mhm.
it's the one novel that I've probably read more than a dozen times.
Yeah.
I just keep coming back to it. And part of that too is the connection to Oklahoma.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, my early experiences were all with writing fiction. I thought I was going to be a novelist.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I started college. Well, I started college thinking I was going to be a journalist, but that didn't pan out. And so then I thought I was going to be a novelist, and that
Mhm.
didn't pan out either.
Yeah, and a lot of poets, I think, start off that way, and that's, his poetry, it's so all encompassing. You can use your own life experiences, you can make up characters.
Hmm.
There's a lot of flexibility, I think, in it, and the way we come to poetry. And there's just so many. I don't know if there's that many poets I've talked to or that are out there maybe listening to this who knew right away that's what they wanted to do. Sometimes it just kind of happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, I guess, a lucky occurrence that I was in a fiction workshop and the professor said basically that I was way too wordy. He said, you need to take a poetry class to learn brevity. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, okay. So I signed up for a poetry class. And in that class, that was it for me. I fell in love. I
Mhm.
suddenly knew what it was I'd been looking for all that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I didn't look back.
So back up a little bit. So in high school, you're writing these short stories. You were reading and reading. What did you dream of becoming after you were done? Was it a novelist? Was that the goal when you started college?
I mean, I did initially, like when I graduated from high school, I really thought I was going to be a journalist. I
Mhm.
spent 3 years running the high school newspaper
Mm.
and wrote more newspaper articles than I did short stories. I mean,
Yeah.
that was my life
Yes.
for 3 years.
Mhm.
Um, and then right as I was getting ready to graduate, my newspaper advisor said basically like you should rethink this.
Oh no.
And at the time I was like kind of shocked, but I
Yeah.
understand looking back that I didn't have the personality type to be a journalist. Um, and I'm actually a very slow writer, right? And you can't do that in journalism.
No.
And so it wasn't a good fit. And so then I sort of shifted my attention to fiction. But I wandered for a few years before I really committed even to fiction, and
Mhm.
then wandered for a few years thinking I was going to do fiction before I found poetry.
Yeah. And just the attention to detail, I think a good poet has to have. And like you mentioned, when just the whole concept of brevity compression, or just thinking about what every word means and its weight and how it sounds and its rhythm and the sentence and what you're trying to do in such a small space. Poetry is expansive, but then it's also so contained too. There's so much that you're doing in just one, in just a few words. So I'm wondering if those early experiences maybe kind of influenced you there. Maybe that's an appeal.
I hadn't thought about that before, but that makes a lot of sense. If my start was in journalism, and you have to cram everything that's important into the first sentence or two, right? That's the most important piece. And so that makes a lot of sense, that I would gravitate towards something where compression is. And I find that to be one of the more fun parts when I'm revising, is going through and editing out anything that feels unnecessary. So I really like the editing part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And just finding that groove, in your revision or in the editing or in the rewriting process, is something that takes, it takes some skill and kind of a rethinking of your piece and understanding of language and all of that. But I wanted to go back a little bit earlier and talk some about your family. So you've mentioned your grandfather and what he did. Can you talk a little bit more about him? How would you describe your grandfather? What was he like, and what was it like having a grandpa who was a preacher?
As a preacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma. I mean,
yes,
that's pretty big.
So he's a Pentecostal minister.
Oh.
So I grew up in a Assemblies of God Pentecostal church, at least when I was with them. And even after we moved away in elementary school, I'd come back every summer to visit my grandparents. And so I think we were very, very close. My grandparents had taken care of my brother and me for maybe a year and a half during my parents' divorce. Like it was just my grandparents taking care of us. And so we bonded pretty strongly. I think I was 2.5 years old. And so in a lot of ways, they became a second set of parents. And so for me, my grandfather, he was like this very sweet man, right? Very kind and loving and gentle. And then he'd get up behind the pulpit and suddenly he was this like booming, strong, like banging on the pulpit, this loud force. Talking about, Pentecostal, so talking about a lot about like hell and fire and brimstone, and like it's very scary. And so it's this like complete opposite kind of experience. But so he was always both. He was both of those things for me. But he was also, I think, the person responsible for my love of language. So every Saturday he would be preparing his sermons in his little study, like clacking away on the typewriter. And he was obsessed with looking up the etymology of words. And he would share that with me. Like, did you know that this word originally meant this, right? And he had all these dictionaries and just was really fascinated with like Latin and Greek roots, and loved the storytelling and the imagery in the Bible. And I think that was the gift, right, that he gave me, and that growing up in that church environment gave me. So, and a lot of that I think comes out in the poems for sure.
Yeah. And just to think, what you have to do to write a sermon too, there's that performance aspect to it, but then you're also choosing, if you're good, and effective at it, think you're choosing your words carefully and thinking about the stories that you'll give to help people understand what's at stake for them, so to
Yeah.
speak, especially in those fiery sorts of things.
The sermons sort of, they taught me too how like imagery can become an argument, right? Like his sermons would make arguments about things, but they were always grounded in the language and in the imagery. So I think that too helped me to think about what poems could do, like how even when it seems like you're just presenting a series of images, there are sort of these implied arguments that you're making about experience, that I think I also learned from watching him perform and reading his sermon notes.
Yeah. And then also, I think in that context, just the authenticity or the sincerity and the power of believing in something and believing those words that you're choosing so carefully and that you're speaking and delivering. Do you think that connects to poetry in some way?
Yeah, I mean,
Possibly?
one of my big drives, I think, comes from this whole idea of witnessing, right? Which is part of the church experience, to stand up and give your testimony.
Yeah.
Which was something that I always found nerve-wracking as a child.
Sure.
But as an adult, it is the thing that maybe I ground the writing in, right? That when I think about what I'm doing when I write, I'm thinking about what I've witnessed, right? What I can give a testimony about, what I can sort of then share, right? Because that's the other part of it, is not just having the experience. The important part of it in church was the sharing of that experience. And so I think that that's also something that drew me to being a writer.
Yeah. So were you close to your grandmother as well? Yeah. What was she like?
Just sweet. Just, sweet woman. My Sunday school teacher, my she, if you had a bad day, she'd bring you a brownie.
Yeah.
Just always sweet. And then later, she was the one that would call every Sunday, to check on you and see how you're doing. And she was a very, very important part of my life.
And then your mother, let's talk about her some, because you've written about her. What was she like?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the writing I did about her was because I didn't get to spend a lot of time with her growing up. So it was 2.5 when my parents split up, and then she was in and out of my life. There were just these brief moments with her, right? It might be a few days at a time. And so I think it was the lack of time that made those moments stand out. Like it was hard to let go of those memories. And so they just sort of played on a loop for a long time. And so I felt like they had to become poems, right? Sort of anything that plays on a loop that I can't get rid of, I feel like has to become a poem. Until I figure out what's happening, why it's on a loop. And so for me, she was this kind of mystery, because I didn't know her well. And then those times when I did get to be with her, it was so dramatically different, I guess, than my day-to-day life. So it stood out a lot to me. But there are also these sort of formative things. Like I think it's interesting. When I was pregnant with my son, I read that like your palate the foods that you would prefer, that begins when you're in the womb, like what your mother eats influences it.
Yeah.
And so I always had these food preferences that I didn't quite know where they came from, but then I'd be with her and I would smell these smells and taste these foods, and it would feel so comforting. It would feel like nostalgic. And so I have started to recognize that there were just some things that were probably there from birth, that were recognizable. And that even if I didn't get to spend a lot of time with her, those moments that I did spend with her, that connection was strong. And so I think a lot of my poems are ways of reconnecting when there's been some sort of disconnect. And so a lot of the poems about her are trying to grapple with that and find a connection.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned food and what that could do, because, of course, what we experience in the womb, and then just the power of smell, that's one of our most primitive senses. And when you write poetry, that's something that, you're thinking about. I was just like your poem in String Theory, watching my mother make kimchi.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. Just the times that you did have with her, what really made an impression on you, and was cooking kind of one way that you could connect?
Yeah, well, cooking is one of her favorite things to do. She loves to garden and grow her own food as much as possible, and then she loves to cook. And so that was a language with which we could communicate, right? We found it difficult a lot of times to communicate about other things, but food was like this neutral subject and a shared hobby. And so over the years, that became my way in, right? To ask her about food, to ask her to teach me how to make something, show me how to make something. And so that was also a way of accessing those memories from when I was a kid, of watching her prepare food for us, which was one of the ways that she was capable of showing love. There were many times, I think, where I didn't recognize. I felt like I wasn't getting what I wanted from my mother, but looking back now, I can see that she was doing what she could do. And for her, feeding you is showing love. It's huge. It's a big thing to place food on your plate, to place food directly in your mouth, which is something else that she does, that those were all ways of showing that love. And so thinking about her and her life, and the way that she uses food as maybe a way of coping, processing, communicating, and showing love, I think has become clearer to me over the years. But I didn't know that when I was writing those poems.
Sure.
They were just images that stood out to me. And then, years later, I'm like, oh, look at how much revolves around food.
Yeah. So your mom's Korean, right? So what was that like for you growing up in Lawton, Oklahoma, mainly with that side of your family that you weren't? So were you close to her family?
Her family was all in Korea. So
okay.
There was a huge disconnect there because of that. So when she wasn't present, right, it was like the whole Korean side of the family wasn't present. And maybe food was the number one way that I stayed connected, because I still had access to that. And that's one of the great things about Lawton, right? Lawton is this diverse community because of the military base. And so it was one of my favorite places to live, because there were like 6 Korean restaurants.
Oh, yeah.
Multiple Korean grocery stores. And a bunch of the kids I went to school with were Korean or half Korean. my best friend, right, is also biracial Korean American. And so I'm thankful for Lawton because it gave me that sense of community and belonging, just because there was so much diversity there.
Yeah, and I think that's important to mention, especially in the context of this project, 'cause, you know, Oklahoma has this reputation, if people know where we are in the, you know, at all, the things that are in the news or that are known about us here aren't necessarily our diversity and what our smaller communities are like, and what life can be like here, you know, outside of the context of living on the East Coast or West Coast, or in a smaller place.
Yeah. Like the fact that there's a huge Vietnamese population in Oklahoma City. A lot of people don't know that about Oklahoma.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's an important thing. I remember being really upset when I read, is it in Ginsberg's Howl, where he has a line about the Chinaman in Oklahoma, and it struck me that the only reason you'd write a line like that is because people would think it was so odd,
right,
to have this Asian sort of character set in Oklahoma. And I was like, but that's not odd.
No,
it's not odd at all.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was one of my earliest moments of becoming aware of the way that people have a stereotype about people from Oklahoma. And that was not my experience of Oklahoma at all.
Yeah, and I think your work really speaks to that point, which we might get back into a little bit later. But I wanted to talk a bit more about your family. So how about your father? What was your relationship like with him? Was it kind of distance, like your mom? Or were you a bit closer because his family was around?
I mean, he's the one who raised me. I mean, with the exception of that year or two with my grandparents, he's the parent that raised me. And so while we might have had a contentious relationship at times,
sure,
I see so much of him in me, and like my personality and the way I approach things. We're very, very similar. And so it's taken me a long time to admit that.
Yeah,
we weren't close, but you can't help but take on, you know, certain aspects of people's personalities, their influence. You can't help but be influenced by proximity. And so just growing up with him and around him, and he's very logical, analytical, very organized, very like Oklahoma work ethic, right? Like if you're going to talk about a stereotype, definitely, like he's all of those things. And so I got all of that from him. And so I appreciate those things now looking back. But yeah, there was definitely, again, a disconnect, the same as with my mother, and this over and over trying to find ways to bridge that and ways to communicate. Like, what are the things we can talk about? And funny enough, with him, it's also food.
Oh, really? Tell me about that.
It's one of the ways that he and I can communicate really well. But for, you know, with him, it's like the food that my grandparents made, you know, the food that he grew up with in Oklahoma. Like, we can talk about chicken fried steak and things like that. And like how to make gravy. I remember asking him to teach me how to make gravy, like cream gravy, real gravy. And that was an important thing for me to learn from him. I wanted to know his way of doing it.
So was that the big recipe, or are there other family recipes that, like, what were his signature recipes growing up? Like, did he
This
stand by
is
his gravy?
chicken fried steak
Chicken fried steak?
and gravy. Yes,
Mhm.
that was his signature dish. We probably had that once a week growing up,
Mhm.
for sure. Yeah. There were other things that I think I got from my grandparents that he didn't make as much, but that I think of when I think of Oklahoma. So maybe, like a big pot of pinto beans
Mhm.
and cornbread was a big
Yes.
thing in my
Yeah.
grandparents' house, and the Sunday roast.
Mhm.
When my grandmother would put it in the oven in the morning and it'd be ready when we
Yeah.
got home from church. Yeah, those kinds of food memories.
Yeah, which could be so powerful, because it's a gathering. It's a, a communing, or um, not a community, because it's your family, but those memories kind of anchor you with them, when words or relationships growing up with them, yeah, well, it's hard being a kid. And
Yeah.
I think kids and teenagers just go through different phases, and there's always some moment where you just don't like any of the grown-ups in your life at some point, I think.
What is it? They say, like, it's not until you realize, when you're older, you realize that they're human beings too, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
they're flawed human beings just like you. And then
Hmm.
you can start to forgive and to get to
Yes.
know them for real. And
Yeah.
you know, I I think maybe when you're young, you're thinking about what you want but don't have,
Hmm.
and not always cognizant of what you have. Um, so, my dad, growing up with him, we had home cooked meals every single day, every day. And
Yeah.
I
Wow.
did not understand just how precious that is
Hmm.
until now. Like, having
Yeah.
become a busy adult with a child, like, I
Yes.
can see how much time and effort that takes. And
Hmm.
so, yeah.
Yeah. And just the way, parenthood and motherhood, that's something that you've written about too. And I'm thinking of, let's see, this is in string theory. I think maybe you published this in Literary Mama, for
Mm,
for, for my mother after becoming a mother. I think
mhm.
this, um, that particular poem, just, it brings in so many different aspects of parenting, of motherhood, specifically of the exhaustion of how, once you're in that situation raising your kid, you can change. You can change in how you maybe have viewed relationships with parents, with your own parents, maybe beforehand.
It,
Did that do that for you? Or, because I know new motherhood, especially, when you're kind of half crazy, not sleeping, I'm thinking of myself. it just you think all kinds of things, in those kind of almost dreamlike states of the new baby.
yeah, that's true. I think it was sort of a bittersweet thing.
Yeah.
Having a child gave me this perspective that I had not had before. On the one hand, I could feel the complexity, like the difficulties that my
Mhm.
parents must have gone through, especially because they were much, much younger than I was when I had my child.
Mhm.
My mother was 18, my father was 23.
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
like 35 when I got pregnant. It's
Yeah.
a big difference. And
Yes.
yet, I mean, I felt the weight of it. And so I tried to imagine what they must have felt that much younger.
Mhm.
But there was that moment of recognition of the way that I bonded with my child
Yeah.
that also forced me to reckon with the fact that my mother left,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
what that meant, what that must have been like, both for her and for me. When my son reached that age, it was an even bigger, like, sort of moment of recognition. I was like, oh, he's now the age that I was. What would that do to him? And so I think for the first time, I could really begin to understand and process what I'd gone through when I was that age, what that must have been like for me, but also how heartbreaking it must have been for her to make that choice.
Yeah. And just the weight and that heaviness, I think, comes through in your work. And that's another thing that I think is so beautiful about poetry, is you can have all of these insights that you don't even know you're having when you're writing it. Or did you feel like that at all when?
No, I mean, it's taken years.
Yeah.
I feel like I'll always be processing those things.
Sure. Yeah.
But
absolutely.
I think the thing about poetry for me is that the possibilities of those images are endless. And so when I'm writing, I'm focused just mostly on the images. And what will come out of that is, like it'll change over time. Just the way that you return to a book, say something you read when you're 18 and then you return when you're 28, and it's not the same book because you're not the same you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I love that you brought up that point. It's good literature or a good poem. Well, you can have a different reading of it each time and experience something else and still want to come back. Or there's those elements of just human truths that the work is bringing out that can change as you change. That there's that timelessness element, I think, to good work or to good literature that has to be there. Maybe that's what we're all aspiring to. I don't know.
For it anyway.
That's a lot of pressure, to just like put a pen to paper and do that. I wanted to talk a little bit about your just your path, your educational path after high school, because you do have a PhD, you have your MFA, you got your undergraduate degree, but it wasn't an easy road for you, right?
No,
and that
it wasn't.
Which I read a little bit. I guess I'm thinking of your impossible essay where you talked about this but tell me about your college experience, and maybe we can focus on those important mentors maybe along the way that encouraged you after you had to kind of take a step back from things as an undergrad.
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of my friends who grew up in Lawton faced similar challenges. And maybe we're friends because we faced similar challenges. That's always a possibility. But we talk about Lawton as being this kind of black hole that can suck you in, and it can be really hard to successfully get out. Especially, I think, when there are things that you're running away from, that you haven't dealt with. And so I think that's kind of what happened to me. I worked so hard through high school to get out. I was a National Merit Scholar and had a full ride to OU. And then I got there and I did not know what to do with myself because I had achieved the thing.
Right. Yeah.
And then there was no next step. I didn't know what to do. And so I just kind of fell apart, because suddenly then I was facing the things that I had been running away from. So all of the traumas, all of the abandonment, like just things that I had not grappled with at all. I was coming face to face with. And so college, became not a priority. And I struggled. I didn't know what to major in. I kept switching departments.
Yeah.
I couldn't commit to being a writer yet.
Yeah.
And that wasn't something that anybody in my life would have encouraged. That was, not a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was odd enough that I was going to college, as first generation. So there wasn't a lot of support there. There weren't people to ask, like, hey, how do I do this? And so I ended up just failing over and over and over. Like I would try and then I would fail and I would try and I would fail. And early on, maybe my second year was the first time I was diagnosed with depression. And so I was grappling with that. And it took a few years of trial and error. And then I went back to Lawton. I went home. I was like, I can't do this. This is not working out. And I went home and I went to Cameron for a while and went back to my friends, like my hometown friends. And I think it was during that time, it wasn't professors. It was those friends, the friendships that I had, the people who were also struggling to grapple with their own traumas, to find ways to succeed in a town that doesn't provide a lot of resources and support, a place that is difficult. There's a lot of difficulty in Lawton. I can't remember the exact number. I have it's in my more recent manuscript. It was something like Forbes rated Lawton like the 8th worst city in the country for violence against women. And that was a big part of my experience in Oklahoma, was the violence against women, and general, sexism.
Yes.
So being back in my hometown and finding that friend group, a group of people who would support that dream, right? Once I decided I wanted to be a writer, which just sounds crazy. That was what did it. I think that made a difference. And then there was a little coffee shop downtown, and Dr. Morris, who teaches at Cameron.
John Morris, is that right? Yep. Yes.
He did a monthly open mic there. And so even when I wasn't going to school, I would go to the open mics, and sometimes I would read, sometimes I wouldn't, but starting to feel like I was part of a community, I think made a huge difference. That sort of ability to find your place, find your people, make your family, right? Was really important. And that all happened in Lawton for me. And once I was able to do that, then I felt like, okay, I'm ready. I can go back to OU. And so I made that my goal. Like, I'm going to get my grades up. I'm going to go back to OU. I'm going to finish what I started. But it wasn't until I had found poetry, found my community, found my friends, that I could do that confidently. And so then I did. I went back to OU and I was like, okay, well, now it's time. So got to make all A's and finish out this major and try to get into graduate school. And so I did. But once I had that sense of this is it, this is what I really want, then it felt like I could make it happen.
Having that grounding and direction, because the writing life, and it's a speculative life, really, at best, that's, you don't know what's going to happen. Anything could happen,
I'm sure. Like you say, I'm going to be a poet.
Then what?
Yeah, you get a lot of those questions, but what are you actually going to do?
The poetry, that's the work. That's the work. But, I guess there's day jobs and things too. So how was graduate school for you? Because you were in Minnesota, right? For your MFA. What was
Yeah.
that like? That sounds like was it just such a different place and like people and experience? How did you ground yourself there?
So interestingly enough, John Morris is
Mhm.
friends with Richard Terrell, one of the faculty
Oh,
at Minnesota State.
oh,
They had
okay.
gone to grad school together, and that's how I learned about Minnesota State.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but those were the best 3 years of my academic life.
Oh, yeah.
The best, the
Yeah.
3 years at Minnesota State.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I wanted to be a poet, but when I got there and I could completely immerse myself, and the MFA program was a 3 year like workshop type experience.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 years of just reading poetry and writing poetry is like the best,
Yeah.
the best thing I could possibly imagine. And there's the same idea, right, of community. So the monthly open mics and
Mm-hmm.
the going out with your classmates after class, and everybody talking about and doing the same things, just all focused on being a writer for 3 solid years,
Mm-hmm.
was amazing. It was amazing. And I think some of my closest writer friends and my support group are still people from that time, that program.
Mm-hmm.
So it was transformative for me. It made me believe that I really was a poet. Like before, I just
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be a poet, but
Mm-hmm.
then there I was like, yes, okay, I
Okay. Yeah.
am. I am
That's
a
great. Yeah,
poet.
that's what I was going to ask next. When did you feel like you found your voice as a poet, or that, yes, this is what I am, this is what I'm meant to do? So what was
Yeah,
there?
it was definitely there. That first semester, first poetry workshop, first poem I brought in,
Mhm.
I knew because they ripped it to shreds. I mean,
Mhm.
just ripped it
Yeah.
to shreds. And I went home after that workshop and I cried.
Mhm.
And then I got on my computer and I started writing, and I wrote for hours, and I did that every night until the next poem was due. And I knew that then that like this was for me. Like it didn't even matter that they had ripped it to shreds or that I had
Mhm.
cried. What
Yeah.
mattered was that it made me want to write a better poem the next
Mhm.
time around. And then every week was like that. And it over time, like I didn't cry anymore.
Mhm.
It didn't bother me anymore. It became this
Yeah.
catalyst for figuring out what my
Mhm.
voice was. I came to enjoy the way that we pushed each other. They pushed
Mhm.
me,
Mhm.
to do new things, to
Right.
go beyond what I was comfortable with, and to really figure that stuff out. And so, and not just inside the workshops, but outside too, like having
Mhm.
all those conversations, reading all these books. That was the other part. I had not had that kind of exposure to reading poetry before.
Mhm.
And so that type of immersion too was huge for me, and made me realize that I had chosen correctly.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was okay. I could do this.
Yeah, just that immersion in the life of the mind and the life of the writer, which there's so many different components. The actual writing part's just one piece, but there's all of these other things that are really important too, such as your reading and how you're interacting with that and the people that you're around, and like you've said, your community.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's all about, because we don't write in a vacuum or to not be read and to not connect with people in some way.
And to have that much time
Yes, yeah.
to do those things, that was a gift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a gift. but you decided to keep going with your school. So
Well, yeah,
the
part of the reason was I thought, I like this. I like the time that it
yes.
affords me. And I wanted to keep working on my book. I didn't
Mhm.
feel like it was done when I graduated. My thesis felt like an early draft,
Mhm.
even though it wasn't. It
Right.
was 3 years worth of work. I just didn't feel like it was ready. And
Mhm.
so I thought, I'll go on, I'll get the PhD. Part of that too is that nobody in my family had ever done that. And
Yeah.
I wanted to be the first, and
Mhm.
to be the first woman, or to have the first person in the family be a woman,
Yes.
was important to me.
Mhm.
But also just thinking about time, the way that another graduate program would give me time to keep having that life, right? Where
Mhm.
your primary job is to read and to write, which I was like, oh, so if I go get the PhD, then maybe I can become a professor and this could be my life for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I decided my second year in the MFA that I
Mhm.
was going to go on and get the PhD and just
Mhm.
keep going. I was like, I'm going to be in college for the rest of my life, one way or another.
Yeah. It's okay. That's good. But you were in South Dakota for your PhD. So what was it? Did you know people there at that program, or what was it like adjusting to
Yeah, I
that
went there
place?
specifically to work with Leanne Roripa.
Hmm.
Um, in the master's, I had studied her book, Year of the Snake, and she had come to be a visiting writer, and we'd done
Hmm.
a manuscript conference together. And I just loved her work and felt connected to what she
Hmm.
was doing. And when I was an undergrad, I didn't understand, I just sort of randomly chose programs to apply to. But
Yeah.
for the PhD, it was important to connect with somebody.
Hmm.
And so um, working with her was the big draw for
Hmm.
me to go to South Dakota. And then talk about a small town.
Yeah. What was that like?
Like 10,000 people, and
Oh, wow.
really long winters with
Yes.
huge piles of snow, and nobody goes anywhere. So
Ooh.
it was almost the perfect place to get a PhD,
Hmm.
because there's
That's all there is to do.
that's all there is to do.
Yeah.
There's no distraction.
Hmm.
It's just all reading and writing,
Hmm.
but also a really nice community of
Yes.
writers there as well. So they had a writers conference every other year that brought in a lot of people from the region as well. And
Hmm.
I really enjoyed those years. I think I was there for 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes a while to get through, but that's quick for English PhD.
I
You
actually
know,
started a
it
full-time
actually
job
is.
before I finished.
Wow. Okay.
Um, it took
Great.
another year or so after. Yeah.
Hmm. So were you in grad school when you had your son, or did you wait until, was that later when you were
No,
working?
I had him while I was in the PhD program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think I was in my last year of coursework
Oh, okay.
when I had
Yeah.
him.
Hmm.
And then the following year had to take exams with a baby.
Yeah.
So that
I've
was,
done that. I've done that. I had my daughter at around the same time in my studies. So how did you get through? My kid like almost choked on, I was preparing for my comps and she got one of my notes and tried to eat it and was kind of so I was panicked that, oh my gosh, is my baby gonna die from my notes for these stupid tests? It was fine. She's fine. But what was that like for you? Because I know it's so intense.
um, it was, we were lucky that the university had childcare.
Oh, wow.
And so I was able to put him in really affordable university daycare
Hmm.
at 10 months old.
Hmm.
And I used every available moment then to go to
Yes.
the library. I
Yeah.
would go to the library so I could feel like it was separate from my personal life. And I
Yes.
could just focus without any
Yeah.
of the chaos of motherhood.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I went to the library every day that I could and studied. And
Yeah.
somehow miraculously.
Yeah. I mean, that's when you find out what you're really made of, I think, in terms of your ability to focus, because a lot of people, I don't know, just in my experience, or maybe this is more with newer writers who aren't into their discipline, like they haven't gotten their routine or decided on how they want to discipline themselves or have to write under certain conditions. But motherhood just throws that all out. Like you just write
Yeah.
because you have to, like you're compelled to.
Yeah. I finished the dissertation while teaching full-time at Cameron and had a toddler. So it became like, okay, I have from say 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. right in my office to write, and that's it. So I better write. So every morning, sit down and churn out a poem until I had enough of them to call it a draft. And that was probably the most disciplined I've ever been.
Yes.
Because that was the only time I was going to get was that time.
Yeah, I think having that time crunch, it forces the discipline if you ever want to get it done. If you have unlimited time, it's so easy to fill it with other things,
Yes.
But yeah, just the way you had to focus there. Yeah, I'm glad you got through. But so how long were you at Cameron before you took this job in Missouri?
3 years.
3 years. Okay.
Yeah. It was nice to go home.
Yeah. I bet.
It was also good because the dissertation was about Oklahoma. And so I had been trying to write about it from a distance, but going back and getting to be there while finishing that manuscript helped a lot. I needed to see the landscape again, feel the wind,
yes,
smell, I know they have a candle scent for different states, and I really want to buy the Oklahoma one and see if it matches what I think of in my mind. But, just to smell the place and be there and see the things that I remember and try to write from those memories was important. And that was a difficult book to write. So I was glad that I got to be at home while I did it.
Yeah. So what's it like? What's it been like for you adjusting to life in Missouri?
It's culturally very similar. Just the landscape is very different. Lots of hills.
Yeah.
The river, the humidity. Those things have taken some adjusting. But culturally, it is so similar that I feel like that wasn't a problem at all. Like I came in and I felt like I instantly felt at home with the students and with my department. I'm still getting used to this small town. Like you said, Lawton was a small town, but I'm like, oh, but here is even smaller.
I know. I grew up not too far from there. So
did you?
Yeah. So I know. Yeah, Lawton's probably pretty big compared to where I grew up, but yeah, it's a lot to adjust to. And then we talked about this a little bit before we recorded the interview, but your writing community, do you feel like you've found one? Or because we had talked about how special the Oklahoma writing community really is statewide.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge for me, partly because of my location. I think that a lot of the literary events are happening in St. Louis or Kansas City, and
Yeah.
I'm not conveniently located. But also I'm extremely shy. And so it takes me a very long time, I think, to get to know a new community. Whereas in Oklahoma, I'd grown up there, right?
Yeah.
And so that was a much easier community to become a part of, as sort of an automatic acceptance. And so here, I think I struggle too, just because I don't feel Missouri enough yet. I feel like I'm an Oklahoma poet. I'm still writing about Oklahoma. All of my poems seem to take place there. And so I just don't quite feel like I'm from here, and I don't know how long it will take before I do. It will probably take a while to get to know the place well enough to feel like I'm from here. But all of the people that I've met have been wonderful. And I do think that there's a good, like, thriving literary community. And I just need to put myself out there.
Right. Yeah.
And get to know them more.
Yeah. It takes time to build those relationships and decide on where you want to go and who you want to spend your time with. And that, it doesn't help that we're in a pandemic, so that kind of makes things a little different or hard to connect with people.
That's true
too.
Everything's been on pause.
Yeah, or on Zoom. I mean, like what we're doing now, it's just a poetry reading. And I feel, just in my experience covering all of these writers here in Oklahoma and going to like Scissortail or participating in that, or to all the other readings that are around the state, there's just this energy that you get sitting in the room and listening to people read their work, that you just can't recreate it any other way.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't think. I mean, we try, we have to adapt, but it can be hard. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your book. So you've got string theory and then your chapbooks. What do you think you've learned about yourself as a writer over time, putting these together?
The biggest thing is that I'm slow. And I used to feel bad about it, but I think I'm starting to come to terms with it. It isn't that I can sit down like I did with the dissertation and I can churn out a poem a day when I need to. But I won't feel satisfied. So the dissertation, just like the master's thesis, I finished it and turned it in, but I didn't feel like it was a finished book. So, my first chapbook was a portion of that longer book, String Theory. And my second chapbook is a portion of this second full-length collection that I've only recently started to feel like is finished. And so my process is just super slow. It took me 10 years to finish String Theory. So I had that small portion that went into the Hanging the Moon chapbook, but the rest, it was, I'd send it out, it'd get rejected, I'd revise a few poems or pull a few and replace them, and the book morphed. And it took 10 years until it felt done and then was published. And now I forget how many years I've been working on this one. 5, I think.
5.
I think about 5 years. And I finally feel like it's come together and feels finished. And so I'm sending it out and seeing how it does finally. So I'm very slow, and it's in the revision and editing process that I'm the slowest.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, just about your writing process. And everyone approaches it a little bit differently. Take me through kind of your first draft, that first, does an image come to you first, as a line, or like we've kind of talked about throughout the interview, maybe you have these certain memories that are just replaying over and over and you have to get them down. Where does a poem start for you?
I mean, it does vary, but
Sure.
with this last collection, I actually made a list of memories. I was like, these are things that have been stuck in my head for years, and I just made a huge list of them, and then started working my way through them, and almost like journaling at first to figure out what images I wanted to work with, what was important about the memory, and then I would take those images and sort of pull them out and plop them into a blank file and just start thinking then about, lines and language and rhythm and how did I want to approach this, often writing sort of toward an image and then away from it to see where it would lead me. And so in some respects, like most of those they're rooted in memory, but that's because this collection is meant to be autobiographical. Like I purposefully wanted to do memoir as poetry, poetry as memoir for this. And so, which some of those are in that Not a Bird or a Flower, that's the portion of the longer collection.
Yeah, which I think is a fascinating direction to take. I've been reading this book called I Had a Brother Once by Adam Mansbach. And he calls it, and it's a book length poem, but it's called a poem and memoir. That's just what's on the cover. And I think that's what's so is kind of compelling maybe to me about poetry and its flexibility, because you can kind of traverse these lines between fiction and nonfiction, and then something beautiful in between. And the way you express it, just like visually on your page can really be all over the place. So
I love the freedom to, I think in some of the poems, I even try to directly address the fact that some of it is not true, right? Like, which is what draws me to poetry in the first place. The fact that I can use things that are autobiographical, but I can also change things, change the color of something, change a particular detail, switch something out because I think it sounds better, and play with those things. But also I was interested in the idea of how we change, and memories are not set in stone either, right? They're fallible.
Yes. It's subjective, so, even in memoir. I mean, it's, I'm thinking of, and this book was published a while back, but John de Agata wrote this piece that he was trying to publish in Harper's that got rejected. And have you heard this about this?
Sure.
So there's this book called Lifespan of a Fact, and it's just the back and forth between this writer and his fact checker, as he was doing what you're doing here. He would change, he's calling it nonfiction in an essay, but he would change a word in a sentence to purple because he liked the way that sounded. Or you know what I mean? Like you just, there's kind of this contract you have with readers when you're calling something memoir or essay or a piece of journalism or whatever. You've got this other relationship with truth and fact. And I think poetry can kind of, because it sounded to me like just the back and forth was that, well, maybe this should have just been a poem or something, because that's what, or just call it fiction. That's what you're doing. So I think I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that poetry can do.
Yeah, I like that it can ride that line. You can move back and forth. That we can say, like, I understand there's a speaker, right? And I can shift the distance between myself and that speaker. And so in each poem, it's different. That gap is different. And even within a single poem, that distance can change. And I like the flexibility that poetry gives me to do that.
Mhm. You know, I'm thinking just about writing and about all of the rejections you get in the writing life, and the way writers have to confront failure. I think if you want to look at it as a failure, you know, just confront that rejection or failure in a way that's just maybe different from how other people might deal with it. Let's see. Oop, let me find this real quick. So in this essay that you had in Voices from the Heartland, called Impossible, you had, I think it's on page 97. You had this list of all of the not so helpful things people told me were or were not possible for me. And I just think, you know, like, you're not cut out to be a writer. You should do something else. You can't do this. You can't do that. What do you think you've maybe learned about yourself as a writer, as a or as a person, and how you approach failure or people telling you, no, you can't do this? Like, where does your resiliency come from? What's your motivation to keep going?
So some of that is just like my stubborn pride.
Yeah.
And that sort of, you know, if I think about the things I learned from my dad.
Yes. So that Oklahoma grit.
Yeah. There is a lot of that in there, that just the idea of like, oh, I can't, well, watch me. And I think that, like, when I was saying that first workshop in the MFA, you know,
Yes.
I was torn to pieces and I cried, but my first instinct was, well, I'm just going to work harder now. And I think that's a big part of my sense of self. That if you tell me I can't, then I'm probably going to find a way.
Yeah. Which I think you have to have that kind of resolve, you know, in the writing life, because it's, when you write something, it's not like you don't have to do it. You can certainly not do it. The world isn't glooming over any writer saying you must do this. I mean, maybe if you've got some kind of deadline, perhaps, but you know, there has to be that resolve I think within yourself to get it done. That goes beyond achievement, you know, like what we've talked about kind of at the beginning of the interview, where you're a National Merit Scholar, you're doing all of this work in high school, and then you get to a place in life where you say, okay, now what is it that will move me forward and fulfill, you know, some sense of purpose within yourself. I think that's good to mention.
Writing is nice because there's no end, right? Like, I'm never going to hit a point where I'm like, okay, that's it. Like, I've accomplished everything there is to accomplish. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
There are always going to be things to learn.
Sure.
And so there's always a forward momentum. There's always a challenge. And that's the other part of my personality that I've sort of figured out through writing. Like, I like challenges, and writing always presents a series of challenges that will never go away. Like, it'll always be that way. It's like the hardest thing that I could, you know, have chosen for myself to do. But that's why I like it. And in the MFA program, they taught us that rejection was like a matter of pride, right? That, well, this was back when rejection slips were on paper.
Yeah.
And so we would collect them, right? And whoever had like the biggest stack,
yeah,
right? That was a matter of pride. Right. I used to tell myself I was going to someday like wallpaper a wall with those rejection slips. And I still have my first rejection slip. Like, I saved it in a folder. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Was it that personalized, or was it just a thing?
No, it wasn't even personalized.
But you did it, you know, you did
Yeah.
it. And then it shows you that you can keep going, you know,
Yeah.
it's a practice and it's bigger than that no. So we talked about, kind of going back to an earlier question. So you talked about getting down your drafts, but how do you know when a poem is finished? When's it done?
Hmm. Never.
Or when's it done enough for you to
When
put
it's
it out there?
published.
Yeah.
I mean, I have felt the desire to go back and revise things even after they were published. So for me, I think it never feels completely done, but I try to get it as far as I can get it to where I think maybe it's publishable, and then I'll send it out. That is different, you know, each time. Sometimes
Right.
that happens quickly. Sometimes it takes years before I look at a poem and think, yeah, that feels complete. So it's just something instinctual for me about it. Like that feeling of, yeah, like this is clicking, this makes sense, or I am not. Because a lot of times the poems are wanting to do something that maybe I don't want to do. And so if I look at it and I'm like, oh, like I'm still shying away from whatever this is really about, then I know it's not done. But if I have pushed through that and gotten to the heart of the thing, whatever it's really about, then I feel that sense of like it clicks and it's probably done. And after that, it's just line editing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about your your manuscript in progress, about done. So, you know, what's next for you, do you think? Is it just working on getting this next book out there, or you have some other things?
Well, yeah, sending this out, trying to get it picked up is my priority right now, but I have a third manuscript project that I want to work on, and I'm in the research phase right now. Again, like I'm a slow writer. I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about the project, and doing research and reading and some traveling, hopefully. But I want to go to Korea, and I've been reading Korean folk tales, and I'm thinking about sort of post-Korean War, South Korea and the American occupation, and biracial children. And so that a lot of that is caught up too with being a girl, like growing up in Oklahoma, being a girl. And one of the things that I think is interesting to me is that a lot of my mother's struggles are very similar to mine. I think that in some ways the sort of sexist Oklahoma culture mirrors some stuff. And so I kind of want to take these female characters from some of these folk tales who have no voice. Things just happen to them. Things are done to them, and give them agency, give them a voice and let them be the speaker, and sort of rewrite these folk tales in a more contemporary setting, but probably in a like post-Korean War, South Korea, and then in the United States, like post-Korean War American setting. So also looking at immigration and some of the things that my mom would have gone through. So that's the next project. But I'm still in the research phase.
Yeah, well, that can all take a while, and it's perfectly fine to just go slow and get it right.
Yeah,
you know, before, especially something like that. So I usually kind of sum up these interviews by asking writers about like what's, and I think maybe we've talked about this a little bit, but if you're giving writing advice to maybe aspiring poets, maybe young poets in Oklahoma or in Lawton or wherever they are listening to this, what's your best writing advice?
My best writing advice is the best advice that I ever got, which was to read widely.
Mhm.
And even now, if I feel stuck, if I feel like I can't write, then
Yeah,
I just read poetry, and that helps unstick things. And so
yeah.
I do think that if you want to write, the best thing you can do is read all
Mhm.
the poetry you can get your hands on. And
Yes.
not just poetry though, right? So read widely, read fiction, read nonfiction, read everything.
Mhm.
Also, sometimes it can feel like you're stuck, and reading helps you feel unstuck as well, right? That
Mhm.
that was a big thing for me while I was growing up in Oklahoma, was that reading gave me that access to other people and experiences that I was maybe missing while I was in high
Yeah.
school there. So read, read, and read, and
Yes.
read.
Yes. I feel like we've covered a lot, although there's always more to talk about, I think, with poetry and someone's work. Is there anything you want to talk about that maybe we haven't covered?
No.
Are you good? Okay. Well, I look forward to reading what you publish next. And I thank you so much for your time, Jenny. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you. I really appreciate you doing this. Thanks.
Yeah.